Imagine the scene: your 3-year-old daughter wakes up from a serious accident and begins to describe, with disturbing clarity, details of a life that never lived. What if she could prove, beyond any doubt, that each word is true? In the dusty archives of the National Anthropology Museum, a lawsuit kept more than 100 years ago continues to intrigue the greatest experts. It is not just a curious case, it is a puzzle that shakes our own foundations of what we believe about the existence, death, and essence of the human soul. It all started on October morning 1903, at the quiet village of San Cristobal, 30 kilometers from Mérida, in the heart of the Yucatan Peninsula. The damp air carried the sweet perfume of the jacaranda, whose flowers shook to the morning breeze. Inside a straw-roof adobe house, the Herrera family led their simple and routine life. Don Alejandro, a fiber merchant of Henequén of 40-2, and his wife Esperanza, a woman of unshakable faith at 30-5, had received, after years of waiting, the greatest gift, the little light Maria. Girl with bright black eyes like obsidian and dark hair that fell on waves on their shoulders, she was the center of her lives, the reason for every smile in those quiet days. That morning, while Esperanza prepared corn tortillas on the wood stove, the smoke smell filled the kitchen. The rhythmic sound of the matate grinding the grains made up a domestic symphony, as familiar as the corner of the roosters. In the backyard, Luz Maria played with her cloth doll, running between the chickens that bicked corn spread across the floor. Its laughter mingled with the cackle of birds and the murmurs away from the neighbors in conversation. But suddenly a sharp scream of Esperanza tore peace of the morning like a dry blow. Luz Maria had slipped on the wooden stairs that led upstairs, falling from a dangerous height. Her fragile body hit hard on the stone floor, producing a deaf sound that froze her parents' blood. Don Alejandro ran from the corral, his boots echoing on the beaten floor, while Esperanza kneeling next to his unconscious daughter. Tears ran down his face as he caressed the girl's pale face. Alejandro, paralyzed, could not react. The neighbors, alerted by the screams, began to peek at the windows, but no one dared to approach. For 3 hours that seemed eternity, Luz Maria remained motionless, with no sign of life. The nearest doctor was in Mérida, too far to arrive in time. Esperanza did not move away for a moment, praying her third with trembling hands, while Don Alejandro walked from side to side, consumed by anguish. When the child finally opened his eyes, something was different. It wasn't just the way he looked around, as if he first saw everything. There was something deeper, a shadow in his eyes that should not exist in such a small child. An expression that made hope to feel a chill through his spine. Luz Maria got up slowly, watching the atmosphere with a look that did not match his 3 years. His eyes, once full of child purity, now carry an ancestral weight, as if they kept memories that did not belong to them. And then, in a clear and firm voice that cut silence like a blade, she spoke the words that would mark the beginning of an unanswered mystery: "This is not my house. I want to go back to my real home. In Chichén Itzá." The silence that followed was so dense that it seemed to suffocate the air. Esperanza and Alejandro exchanged a loaded look with relief and at the same time a deep perplexity. Her daughter had woken up, but there was a problem: no one in the family had ever mentioned Chichén Itzá in front of her. As a 3-year-old child who had never left the small village, could he know the name of Yucatan's most famous Mayan ruins? In the following days, a misleading calm has taken over the house. Esperanza tried to convince herself that her daughter's words were just delusions caused by the fall. After all, children say strange things when they are confused or scared. But deep in his Catholic soul, a doubt grew like a seed planted on fertile land, insisting on sprouting. Life in San Cristobal followed his usual pace. The mornings began with the corner of the roosters and the scent of coffee being toasted in the courtyards. The women were going to fetch water from the central source with their mudflakes, while men departed to the fields of Henequén, who extended to where the view reached. It was a simple existence, governed by traditions that were repeated for generations. In this predictable world, however, Luz Maria began to stand out as a dissonant note in a known melody. 3 days after the accident, while Esperanza embroidered in the shadow of a tree from Ceiba, he heard his daughter singing in the backyard. It was not a song she had taught her. The words sounded strange, with a musicality that shivered the skin. "Skel, jab kin, uyal cax," the girl murmured as she got stones in perfect geometric patterns on the floor. Esperanza dropped the needle. That was not Spanish, nor any language she knew. It sounded old, as if it came from voices that had been silent for centuries. "What are you singing, my love?" he asked, his voice shaking. Luz Maria raised his eyes, and his black gaze shone with an intensity that did not match his age. "It's the song of the moon, Mom. I sang every night in the temple to calm the gods." The thread slipped from Esperanza's hands. "What temple, daughter?" "The Jaguar Temple," the girl answered, with a frightening naturalness. "There I lived before. I took care of the sacred flowers and spoke to Itzamna in my dreams." That night, when Don Alejandro returned from the countryside, his hands dirty and his hat covered in dust, Esperanza told him everything. Her husband, a practical man and used to dealing with concrete problems, heard as he washed his hands in the clay basin. "It's just imaginations, Hope," he said, trying to reassure her. "Children invent stories all the time." But his certainty would be shaken the next day. Don Alejandro found Like Maria on the kitchen floor, drawing with a piece of coal over the stones. They were not childish scribbles. They were complex symbols, precise geometric shapes, perfect circles intertwined with lines, figures that resembled animal heads and stylized human silhouettes. All done with a skill that made any adult impressed. "What is that, Luz Maria?" he asked, kneeling beside him. "It's the stone words, Dad," the girl answered, without taking her eyes off the drawing. "So we wrote in my time for priests to read the messages of the gods." Don Alejandro felt the floor shake under his feet. Those symbols. He had seen them before, years ago, when a foreign archaeologist passed through the village showing photographs of the Maya's ruins. In the weeks that followed, light behavior Maria became increasingly intriguing. At night, he hopes hearing her whimper, muttering words in that unknown tongue, as if he talked to someone or something that only she could see. He rapped the book of records with a dry crack that echoed through the empty room. The ink of that marginal annotation, though faded with time, seemed to burn his fingers like living embers. Jade objects buried in the posterior courtyard. The same words that Esperanza had whispered hours earlier, with the trembling voice of those who fear to confirm what they already know. It was not coincidence. It couldn't be. Father Vasquez spent the night in course, the weight of that revelation oppressing his chest like a stone lassa. At dawn, when the first rays of sunny were filtered through the Gothic window of the sacristy, he had already made a decision. It was no longer a matter of faith or superstition, it was something much deeper, something that challenged even the laws of reason he had vowed to defend. If those glyphs in the Jaguar of Jade were authentic, if the memory of Like Maria was not the result of a feverish imagination, then he was facing a mystery that transcended everything he knew. What if she were right? What if that child, with his eyes that kept centuries of silence, were it really what it seemed to be? At noon, Father Vasquez knocked on the Herrera door with a determination that did not match his usual serene way. Don Alejandro, with deep dark circles and still trembling hands of the fright of the night before, received him with a tired nod. Without preambles, the priest extended a yellowish paper on the wooden table spent over time. "This was found in the parish archives in 1892, he said, pointing to a faded sketch. A map of the ruins under the church, made by a priest who suspected that the demons had not been totally expelled from that place. There is a sealed chamber under the altar. And, according to the records, it has never been opened." Esperanza took her hand to her mouth, choking a scream. Maria, sitting on the floor playing with a wool, lifted his eyes with a disturbing calm. "That's where the other codes are," he said, as if talking about time. "Those I hid before I left." The silence that followed was cut only by the sound of the wind shaking the dried corn leaves against the adobe wall. Don Alejandro sank in his chair, as if his legs no longer support him. "Are you suggesting that we open it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Father Vasquez looked at the child, whose small fingers traced invisible patterns on the ground dust. "I'm not suggesting anything," he replied, with gravity that made his words sound like an oath. "I'm saying it's already open." The eyes of Like Maria shone with a knowledge that did not belong to that it was. "Kunapka showed me," whispered. "The stones moved last night. The way is free now. Just someone is missing, brave enough to enter." Father Vasquez closed the document with hands that trembled. How could a 3-year-old know details kept in files he had never seen? How could you describe, with surgical accuracy, the location of an object buried centuries before your birth? For the first time since his ordination, Father Miguel Ángel Vasquez felt the weight of a doubt that his faith could not support. The news of the strange case of the Herrera spread across the region as the hot wind that precedes the storm, carrying the smell of the burnt copal and the murmur of the ancients. In Merida's markets, among tropical fruit salespeople and Anican traders, the tongues were released. The girl was talking about the forgotten gods. The stories grew with each repetition, adorned by popular imagination, but the core remained disturbing, unchanging, as a truth that refused to be ignored. This is how the name of Luz Maria reached the ears of Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a 53-year-old German archaeologist whose life had been consumed by the study of Mayan civilization. Zimmermann landed on Mexican soil in 1895, as part of a scientific expedition been the University of Berlin, and since then, the ruins of Yucatan had become their obsession. Set men cut with military accuracy and blue eyes that burned with the intensity of those who had unveiled millennial secrets, he was respected by his peers not only by scientific rigor, but for mastering the hieroglyphic writing, a field still in his childhood, where few dared to enter. In that scorching December, Dr. Zimmermann arrived in San Cristobal in a trailer crowded with books, measuring instruments, and photographs of archaeological sites. The dust of the road covered its white linen costume and the wide flat hat, but nothing could overshadow the determination that burned in his gaze. His first destination was the church, where Father Vasquez received him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Finally, a man of science could shed light on what challenged all logic, or at least offering an explanation that did not depend on miracles. "Dr. Zimmermann," said the priest while serving fresh water in rustic clay glasses, "I read your articles in the archaeological magazine. If someone can help us understand this, this is the Lord." The German heard in silence while Father Vasquez narrated the events of recent weeks. His face remained impassive, professional, but when the priest mentioned the glyphs that Luz had designed in Jade's figurine, his eyebrows arched almost imperceptibly. "Could you see these drawings?" he asked in a careful Spaniard, marked by the Germanic accent. Father Vasquez led him to the side wall of the church, where he had allowed the girl to bring her symbols with charcoal. Zimmermann approached, adjusting his glasses, and what he saw stole his breath. The glyphs were not just accurate in their form, they were perfect in their syntax. They formed coherent phrases in classic Mayan, a writing system that he himself had taken years to decipher only partially. "Mein Gott," he murmured in German before translating, with a hoarse voice, "Ishel, guardian of the sacred moon, protects the secrets of the eternal jaguar." Father Vasquez felt his legs weakened. "Are you sure, doctor?" "Absolute." Zimmermann pointed to a sequence of glyphs at the bottom. "And there is more. Here it says, in the place where the stone snakes rest, the codices await the return of the priestess." That afternoon the Herrera received the visit of the archaeologist. Esperanza had worked out in cleaning the house, and Don Alejandro had dressed his best guayabera, as if presenting that meeting would mark one before and one after in his lives. Luz Maria played quietly in the courtyard, oblivious to the whirlwind that his existence had triggered. When Zimmermann entered the house and his eyes found those of the girl, something extraordinary happened. Luz Maria raised his face from the toys, set him for a moment that seemed to be eternalized, and then smiled with a familiarity that froze the German's spine. "Her doctor!" he exclaimed, running toward him, his voice overflowing with joy. "I knew you would come. I've seen him in my dreams." Zimmermann retreated, shocked. The child had pronounced the words with an impeccable German accent, something impossible in that region where no one spoke the tongue. Before he could question, Luz Maria interrupted him, his eyes shining with an intelligence that did not belong to his age. "The Lord seeks the secrets of my people. It has dug in Palenque, but the biggest treasures are in Chichén Itzá, in a place that only I know." The hands of the archaeologist shake. His excavations in Palenque was confidential information, known only by a restricted circle of academics in Europe. None of that project had been published. "Girl," he tried, the voice controlled by a thread of rationality. "How do you know about Palenque?" Luz Maria closed his eyes, immovable, as if he consulted memories buried in time. There is a tomb under the Temple of Inscriptions. A king named Pékel rests there with a jade mask. He opened his eyes and looked at him straight. But this is not the most important. What matters is the codices hidden in a secret chamber, behind the jade waterfall. Zimmermann's world spun. Pékel's tomb was a discovery that his team had made for only 3 months, information not yet disclosed. And the jade mask? Exactly what they had found. But the jade waterfall? The secret chamber? That was something like him or his team knew. Jade waterfall. He repeated, as if the words weighed tons. Yes, the girl confirmed, Serena. It is at the lower level, behind the stone with the descendant jaguar glyph. If they move this stone, they will find the passage. Dr. Zimmermann fell into a wooden chair, feeling the foundations of his scientific world shudder. A 3-year-old described, with surgical accuracy, details of a place that he himself had excavated in confidentiality, and even offered him information that could rewrite the story. Her doctor, Luz Maria, continued, his soft voice like a night breeze, "The Lord will take me home in Chichén Itzá. I need to show where the codices that talk about the return of souls are." For the first time in his career, Heinrich Zimmermann was in the abyss of a mystery that science could not explain. And for the first time, he began to question whether there were strengths in the universe that even transcended even the most rigorous logic. The expedition to Chichén Itzá was organized under the facade of an anthropological study, with permits duly signed by the government of Porfirio Diaz. Officially, it was a research on the oral traditions of Yucatan rural communities. But in the heart, Zimmermann knew, that was much more than folklore. It was a call. The caravan departed from Mérida in a dawn of January 1904, when the air still saved the freshness of the night and the first lights of the dawn painted the sea as cups. 2 trailers, loaded with excavation equipment, a week for 1 week, and 3 passengers whose expectations diverged like ways in the jungle. Dr. Zimmermann, with his scientific skepticism now fissured by a restlessness that grew as a root of Saba, watched every detail with the accuracy of who knows he is on the verge of an abyss. Don Alejandro, his face contracted in a tension mask, squeezed the straw hat between his fingers like a talisman against the unknown waiting for them. And then there was her, Luz Maria. 3 years old, his bare feet swinging at the rhythm of the truck, while his children's voice chanting songs in Maya so old that they made the air vibrate. The girl's eyes black as wells of Chultan, deep as the mysteries they kept, seemed to map the way with a familiarity that challenged time. Esperanza had stayed in San Cristobal. Not out of fear of what they could find, but of what they could confirm. He preferred the doubt to the overwhelming weight of a truth that could crumble everything that was left of his sanity. The way, however, gave no respite. It was a serpent between the thick jungle, where sunlight could barely pierce the canopy of leaves, and sacred milpas, where corn grew and rose so perfect that they seemed traced by divine hands. The screams of spider monkeys echoed as warnings of the ancients, while toucans crossed the sky in flashes of impossible colors. It was a land that time had forgotten or deliberately chose to preserve. When it was an hour to reach the ruins, the impossible happened. Luz Maria, who was sleeping on his father's lap like any child after a long trip, suddenly opened his eyes, not with the drowsiness of awakening, but with the clarity of those who have just remembered a living dream. He lifted into the trailer, the tense body like a ready-to-fire bow, and began to point to the jungle with a certainty that froze Zimmermann's blood. There, whispered in Maya, the sacred scene where we made the rain ceremonies. His small but firm finger indicated an indistinguishable section of the rest. And there, the white path that leads to the Temple of the Virgins of the Sun. The German archaeologist ordered them to stop. His maps, drawn with the Germanic accuracy that proudly confirmed, yes, there should be a cenote in that direction. As for the White Way, it could only be as sacred, those high sidewalks that the Mayans built to connect their ceremonial centers, a knowledge that no 3-year-old, raised in a remote village, could have. Unless. When Chichén Itzá ruins emerged before them, bathed by the vertical light of noon, the pyramid of Kukulkan rose as a challenge to heaven, his shadows dancing over the stones as light snakes. But it was not the architectural spectacle that snatched Zimmermann. It was Maria's cry of light. They were not tears of a child scared with the size of the structures. It was an old lament, a weeping that seemed to sprout from a memory buried for centuries. Where are they all? He shouted, his eyes flooded as they swept the empty platforms. "Where is my people? Why is everything so quiet?" Before someone could stop her, went down the truck and ran toward the pyramid with a security that only those who belonged to that place could have. His barefoot feet knew every irregularity of the ground, every loose stone, as if they had stepped there for days, but it was. "Light Maria, wait!" Don Alejandro ran after her, his heart beating his ribs like a war drum. She didn't stop. Upon reaching the base of the pyramid, he knelt and began to speak of Maya Classic, the words flowing from his lips like water from a newly opened Chultan. Zimmerman, despite his limited language knowledge, captured fragments, invocations to Kukulkan, references to closed and reopening cycles, and something about the return of the guardian. His notebook was shaking in his hands as he wrote down every syllable, every intonation, as if he were recording not the voice of a child but the echo of a priestess. After minutes that looked like hours, Luz Maria got up and walked straight to a specific point of the pyramid. He stopped before an identical stone to hundreds of others, touching it with a reverence that made the archaeologist feel the weight of centuries over his shoulders. "Here," he said, simple as that. "The codices are here. Behind this stone." Zimmerman approached, the trembling fingers passing over the surface. At first, nothing. But when the sun changed its angle, it turned out an almost imperceptible glyph, recorded with such mastery that it would only be seen by those who knew where to look. The descendant jaguar symbol, the same as Light Maria had described weeks earlier, in Palenque, with precision that had left him sleepless for nights in a row. With hands that now trembled not skepticism, but of reverence, the German pressed the stone at the exact angle that Menon indicated it. A death snap. An old air sigh, loaded with the smell of copal and scented secrets for centuries. And then, there, in the hidden space behind the stone, 3 codices wrapped in tissues that challenged time, their still vibrant colors as if they had been woven yesterday. Zimmerman held them as if they were fragments of a dream that could fade at any moment. The first pages revealed astronomical maps of amazing accuracy, prophecies about cycles that were chained as snakes devouring their own tails, and, his breath failed, the story of Skell, a priestess who had sworn to return in new form to reveal the mysteries of life beyond death. The same story as a 3-year-old girl had been telling word for months. The sun was already beginning to decline when Zimmerman made a decision that his scientific training would never approve. They would be. It was not just by codices, it was for something deeper, a visceral certainty that the night would bring revelations that the day had not dared to show. They set up camp near the Temple of the Warriors, where the carved columns projected elongated shadows, such as petrified sentries of a time that refused to die. Don Alejandro lit a bonfire, whose flames danced on the stones as freed spirits. Luz Maria sat next to the fire, his legs crossed, his eyes fixed on the flames as if they read in them a future already written. From time to time, his lips moved in murmurs, words in Maya so low that they were confused with the crack of the embers. Zimmerman, with the notebook open on his lap, tried to capture every sound, every gesture, while the night fell on Chichén Itzá like a robe of stars. And then, when the shadows of the pyramid began to stretch like claws on the earth, Luz Maria rose. His face, illuminated by fire, looked sculpted in ancient gold. "They are coming," he said, "not to them, but to darkness beyond the flames." Zimmerman felt the air dense. Did not ask who. I no longer had the courage to doubt. Because, deep down, he already knew. When darkness completely seized the ruins, turning the stones into clipped silhouettes against the starry sky, Luz Maria stood up with a determination that made adults Luz, surprised. It was not the stubbornness of a child, but the silent authority of those who carry a destination in their hands. "It's time," he announced, without taking his eyes off the pyramid of Kukulkan, that he rose like a portal between the earth and the constellations. "What time, small?" Don Alejandro's voice trembled, not by the cold of the night, but for something deeper, something he crawled under his skin as a omen. "Kunubkuk called me." The answer came without hesitation, as if the words were already recorded in the air, waiting for only the time to be said. "I need to go up to the temple. The ceremony that was interrupted must be completed." Zimmerman dropped his instruments with a dry noise. The fire crackled, throwing dancing shadows over the girl's face, a face that suddenly no longer belonged to a child. There was something old there, something that looked through her, as if the centuries had found a crack to squeeze between his eyelids. Luz Maria, it's dangerous to climb the pyramid at night, he argued, although he knew deep down that his words were useless. The stones are loose, the way is treacherous. There is no danger for those who know every step. Her voice cut off yours, serene as the surface of a lake before the storm. Ichel climbed these steps for decades. My feet know the way. And without waiting permission, she started walking. Don Alejandro moved to follow her, but a single look of his daughter stopped him in place. It was not a child's tantrum, but the silent order of someone who had already given more explanations than necessary. Dad, this is something I should do alone, he said, without turns, no sweetness. But you can see. They will see things that will help them understand. And then it went up. What followed in the following minutes challenged not only logic, but the very notion of reality that Zimmerman had built over a life dedicated to science. Luz Maria climbed the steep pyramid staircase with precision that did not belong to a 3-year body. Each step was calculated, each movement flowed as if it had repeated the journey not dozens, but thousands of times. There was no hesitation, there was no fear, just the absolute certainty of those who returned to a place they never really left. But the most disturbing was not physical ability. It was the transformation. As she ascended, her silhouette against the starry sky seemed to expand, as if the darkness around her was woven by her own hands. The sounds of the jungle, the crickets, the bats, the wind between the leaves, were erasing one by one as candles blown by an invisible breath. Even the air seemed to hold his breath. When he reached the top, Luz Maria went straight to the small temple in the summit. He positioned himself in the exact center, stretched his arms to the sky, and then his voice, small and fragile, rose in a song that should not fit in his throat. It was an old Maya. It was power. Zimmerman and Don Alejandro, properties below, heard each word with supernatural clarity, as if the pyramid itself were an instrument in tune to amplify that sound. The archaeologist recognized fragments, invocations to the creative gods, references to cosmic cycles, prayers by the Maya people. But there was more. Much more. The girl was reciting dates. Specific dates of the Maya calendar, aligned with astronomical events that were yet to come: eclipses, planetary conjunctions, phenomena that would not occur in decades. Calculations that would require not only advanced knowledge, but an understanding of the time that transcended human linearity. And then it happened. The full moon, hitherto hidden behind thick clouds, emerged just as Luz Maria lifted his arms. Its silver light flooded the pyramid, and for a moment that stretched as an eternity, the silhouette at the top changed. It was no longer a child. She was a woman. High, majestic, dressed in the ceremonial ornaments of a priestess, quetzal feathers intertwined in black hair that fell to the waist, golden braceletes shining under the moonlight, jade embedded in every detail of his costume. Their movements were fluid, their gestures loaded with a sacred weight. Zimmerman and Don Alejandro saw. Not as a delirium, not as a trick of light, but with the cruel sharpness of reality. And then, as fast as it had appeared, the vision broke. The clouds covered the moon again, and there was Light Maria, down the steps with the same impossible grace, until, when he reached the ground, he ran into his father's arms and buried his face in his chest, being, in the blink of an eye, just a girl. "It's all ready, Dad," he murmured, his voice muffled against the fabric of his shirt. "Now I can rest. I fulfilled my promise to return and deliver the sacred knowledge." Zimmerman approached, shaking hands, mind a storm of unanswered questions. "Light Maria. What happened up there?" She looked at him. His eyes, once so deep that they seemed to contain oceans of time, were now lighter, as if an ancestral burden had finally been deposited in the right place. "Ichel is gone," he said, simple. She returned to her place among the stars. "Now, I'm just like Maria Herrera." And these reminders, paused, as if looking for the right word, they will fade as dreams when the sun rises. And so it was. When the dawn painted the stones of Chichén Itzá de Rosa, something in the girl had changed. The eyes that once seemed to carry memories of past lives now shone only with the innocent curiosity of a 3-year-old child. I no longer talked about Maya. Did not draw glyphs. Did not mention ceremonies or gods. The codices they found that night became some of the most important Maya's documents ever discovered, revealing astronomical knowledge that adhered to decades the scientific understanding of that civilization. But the story of how they were found never stated in the official reports of Zimmermann. Some truths, he wrote in his personal diary, they are too deep to be understood by the science of their time. 20 years later, in 1924, Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann returned to Yucatan for the last time. Her hair was completely white, and the wrinkles on her face were like grooves of all the expeditions she had lived and the questions that consumed it. In his bags, he carried copies of the Chichén Itzá codices, documents that had revolutionized studies on Maya astronomy and now occupied places of NRA in the most prestigious museums in the world. But it also carried something heavier, the questions that had plagued him for 2 decades. His first stop was San Cristobal. The village had grown, but still retained the tranquility of yore. Herrera's house remained standing, now with a more exuberant garden and signs of a prosperity that spoke of prosperous years. Esperanza received him at the door, his face marked by time, but his eyes still shining with the same warm familiarity. Don Alejandro had left 5 years earlier, the victim of a fever his body could not win. But according to Esperanza, he had died alone, knowing that he had witnessed something that few men would have the honor or the burden to see. "What a joy to see him after so long, Doctor," Esperanza said, with a smile that carried both longing and secrets. "Luz Maria will be so happy." Luz Maria was now 20-3 years. The deep-eyed girl had become a woman of serene beauty, with the same black and intense look, but now full of the vitality of her youth. He had married a village teacher and had 2 young children who played in the same courtyard where, years earlier, she had drawn glyphs on earth with a piece of coal. "Doctor!" she exclaimed, with a genuine glow in her eyes as she recognized him. "How long?" "My mother told me that her discoveries were very important." Zimmermann watched her carefully, seeking any trace of those old eyes that once inhabited that little body. But there was nothing. Luz Maria was now only a young Mexican mother, with concerns and dreams common to her age. His gestures, his laugh, even the way he slightly frowned when trying to remember, everything was so natural that it seemed impossible that same woman had already been something else. "Do you remember something from our trip to Chichén Itzá?" he asked, with a curiosity that could barely disguise. She paused, as if he searched distant memories. "I remember it was exciting to travel so far, and there were a lot of big stones," he said, with a shy smile. "But I was very small. The truth is that the memories are very vague. The drawings you made, those strange symbols, laughs, shaking your head. You know how it is, Doctor. My mother always tells this story. He says I went through a phase in which I invented my own language and made complicated scribbles." His eyes shone with fun. "Children do such curious things, don't they? My own children also make up strange games all the time." There was no pretense in his words. There was no doubt. For her, it was all children's mischief, amplified by a mother's effective memory. The extraordinary months of his childhood had dissolved as smoke, leaving only the echo of a story told in the light of the stove, between laughs and hot cafes. It was just that afternoon, as the sun leaned over the courtyard in shadow of Ceiba, now robust, almost a living monument extended over them, that Esperanza told Dr. Zimmermann a secret he had kept for years. "Doctor, there's something I never told you," he said, with a low voice, almost a whisper. "After that trip, when Luz Maria became a normal child, I found something in his room." He led him to his daughter's old room, where, at the bottom of a dusty cabinet, a small wooden box was resting like a forgotten memories. Inside, carefully aligned, were jade stickers, small, but of such exquisite work that they seemed carved by hands that knew the secrets of time. Each brought capital glyphs, recorded with accuracy that challenged the age of the girl who had supposedly found them. "They appeared in the weeks following our return," Esperanza confessed, her fingers shaking slightly by playing the pieces. "I found them in the places where Light Maria played." When she asked her where they came from, she just shrugged. "They said they were simply there." Zimmermann held one of the stickers, spinning it in the light that entered the window. The glyphs formed a sequence, a narrative about the journey of the soul, the eternal dance between death and rebirth. It was authentic. It was old. And above all, it was impossible. "Why did you never tell me?" His voice was hoarse, loaded with a mixture of Spanto and disapproval. Esperanza lowered her eyes, her hands intertwined as in prayer. Because I was afraid, doctor. Fear that the Lord would take her again. A tear ran down his face, silent. She was my daughter again. I just wanted it to continue to be. That night, in his room at the small hotel of San Cristobal, Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann opened his leather diary spent and let the words flow, loaded from the weight of 2 decades of silence. I dedicated my life to science, the search for logical answers to the mysteries of the world. But what I witnessed in 1904 surpasses any explanation that our reason can offer. The codices that light took us, or that, through it, were revealed, contain knowledge that the Mayans should not possess. Astronomical equations of scary accuracy. They anticipate cosmic events yet to come, centuries ahead of our time. But the most disturbing are not the documents themselves. It is the fact that all this was transmitted by a 3-year-old, without formal education, in a village where no one spoke or wrote in Maya Ancient. A child who later did not keep any memory of that. As a scientist, I must record the facts. As a man, I must admit that there are strengths in this world, or beyond him, that our current understanding cannot embrace. If souls can, in fact, return. If knowledge can flow through the centuries by ways we are unaware of, then our view of consciousness, memory, and the very nature of existence needs to be rethought. The codices are now in museums, studied and catalogued. But the true importance of this case is not in the artifacts. It is in the question he asks us. How far we call death is actually a beginning. For skeptics, it will always be easier to label the case as a mere extraordinary coincidence, as the fruit of a prodigious child mind, or even as a misinterpreted spiritual phenomenon. But for those who plunged into the full documentation, who examined the photographs, the meticulous transcripts, and the haunting level of precision in the girl's knowledge, the simplest explanation can be, paradoxically, the deepest, that death is not the end of consciousness but a metamorphosis. That soul commitments transcend the borders of time. And that, at rare occasions, when conditions align with almost sacred accuracy, the veil between the worlds becomes so thin that past and present can intertwine for a moment. On the clear nights of Chichén Itzá, when the full moon sheds its silver light on the pyramids, the guides still whisper to visitors the legend of the girl who returned to reveal the secrets of the ancients. Science, of course, will persist in seeking tangible responses, dissecting the phenomenon with methods and theories. But perhaps the greatest truth is precisely in the mystery that resists the explanation, in the reminder that the universe is much wider, more enigmatic, and more sublime than our limited reason can embrace. Some puzzles are not here to be resolved, but to remind us that, in the infinity, we are eternal apprentices.